It's the FIDE World Cup, and we have a heavyweight clash between China's Yangyi Yu and Russia's Ian Nepomniachtchi. This is going to be a firecracker. We open with a Grinfeld defense, one of the sharpest and most dynamic ways to play against d4. Both players are blitzing out their moves, heading straight for a theoretical battle in the center. And there it is. White pushes the pawn to e4, a brilliant sacrifice, giving up a pawn to build a massive, controlling pawn center, a bold statement of intent from Yangyi. Nepo accepts the challenge. The knight takes the knight on c3, calling White's bluff, and pawn takes knight on c3 is a fantastic reply. The only move to keep the advantage, and now look at that beautiful pawn structure for White. And the idea is clear. If Black pushes the pawn to c5, White develops the knight to f3. After bishop to g7, the bishop comes to b5 with check, and that's just winning a piece. The game continues logically. Black develops the bishop to g7 and challenges the center with c5. After a check on b5 is met by knight to c6, both sides complete their development, and White pushes the pawn to d5, cramping Black's position. But look at this! Nepomniachtchi fires back with a brilliant counter-sacrifice. The knight leaps into e5, giving up a piece to blast open lines for his powerful bishops. What a fight! White doesn't hesitate, snapping off the knight on e5, and Black's bishop recaptures on e5, creating an incredibly sharp and unbalanced middle game. This is anyone's game. The position explodes. Black snags a pawn on the queen side, but White isn't bothered, launching a direct assault on the king side with a pawn storm, starting with the pawn to h4. The pawns are flying. White pushes to h5, Black's queen grabs another pawn on a2, and the king side is ripped open. Both players are attacking with everything they've got. Amidst the chaos, White calmly tucks the bishop back to h3, keeping the pressure cooker on high. And here, Nepo makes an inaccurate move, letting his edge slip away. He had a chance to create serious problems on the queen side. Pawn to b5, queen to d3, pawn to b4, bishop takes pawn on c5, pawn takes pawn on e4, but in the game, the queen slides to a4, and this is a mistake. It allows White to force a queen trade and steer the game into a much better endgame, and Yangyi is ruthless, immediately capturing the queen on a4, a fantastic recapture. The bishop takes the queen on a4. This is the only move that keeps Black in the fight, holding the position together by a thread. White now cashes in, taking the pawn on c5. The rooks swing into the game with rook to b6 and rook to f3, and White is methodically increasing the pressure in this endgame. The endgame remains incredibly tense. Black creates a passed pawn on e4, White pushes the f-pawn forward, and both sides are fighting for every inch of the board. And here, White makes a small slip, letting Black back into the game just a little. There was a more precise way to press the advantage. Bishop to g4, bishop to d7, bishop to d4, rook to g7, rook to g6. Instead, in the game, White captures the pawn on e7, which is still good, but gives Black a little more breathing room. We see some complex maneuvering. Black's bishop becomes a real pest, checking on b6, while White pushes the dangerous d-pawn all the way to d6. The tension is at its peak, and this is the moment the game is decided. Black makes a fatal mistake. It looks threatening, but it's a tactical blunder that loses on the spot. Bishop to d4, bishop takes pawn on g5, bishop to f2, rook to h6, check king to g7. But back in the actual game, Nepo pushes the pawn to e3, and this is the losing move. White now has a forced win. The punishment begins. The rook snaps up the pawn on g5, tearing open the defenses around the king. Black scrambles to defend, bringing the rook to g7 to cover the king. White trades with rook, takes rook on g7 with check. It's a winning move, but not the most clinical. Bishop to f6 was even stronger, winning material on the spot. An excellent recapture. Black's rook takes on g7. This is the only move, keeping the dangerous passed e-pawn as a last-ditch source of counterplay. And a fantastic check. Rook to h5 is the only move that maintains the win, forcing the Black king onto a more vulnerable square. The king is forced back to g8, right into the teeth of the attack. Another brilliant, only move. The pawn pushes to f6, a fantastic shot that cuts off the king's escape and solidifies White's grip. And here's why it works. If the pawn pushes to e2, the rook swings to e5 to block it. After rook to h7, the rook simply takes the pawn on e2, and it's all over. And this is the final decisive mistake from Black. The position was already lost, but this move allows a spectacular finish. Pawn to e2, rook to e5, rook to h7, rook takes pawn on e2, king to f7, but instead the bishop moves to g4, and this walks right into a stunning combination. Wow! Rook to h8, check! A brilliant rook sacrifice. Yu Yangyi sees the win and goes for it with this beautiful shot, setting up a crushing discovered check. There's no choice. The king must take the rook on h8. And here it comes. The pawn takes the rook on g7. A devastating discovered check from the bishop, again forced. The king must recapture the pawn on g7, and the bishop takes the bishop on g4. The combination is complete. White emerges a full piece up, and the game is won. From here, the rest is technique. After king to f7, the white king marches up to g3. Black can push the a-pawn, but the bishop calmly drops to e2, and white is simply winning. Black plays the bishop to c5, a final inaccuracy in a completely hopeless position. And now we see the final cleanup. White's king marches up the board to f3 to support the win, easily dealing with black's desperate pawn pushes on the queen side. And what a move. Bishop to e6 is the perfect final touch. A great move that shuts down every last bit of black's counterplay. The idea is simple. If the king goes to g6, white pushes the g-pawn. After king to g7, the bishop swings to a2 to stop the pawn, and it's completely over. A final pawn push to b6 from black, but the writing has been on the wall for a long time. White tucks the bishop to b3, a simple, solid move, and at this point Ian Nepomniachtchi has seen enough. And black resigns. A spectacular tactical victory for Yu Yangyi. Nepomniachtchi saw that he was down a clean piece with no counterplay, and the position is hopeless. White's winning plan from here is simple. If pawn to b5, the g-pawn pushes forward. After pawn to b4, the bishop moves to c4, and after king to g6, white will just mop up.